Okay, well, let's get going. We had a board meeting of the Committee for the Republic last week, and I said, why don't we just take a break and not, we can't get in the Metropolitan Club. The only members can go in. 90% of our members are of the committee are not members of the club, and they 20, 30 people limitation. So that's obviously wearing masks. That's not what we're going to do. So why don't we just take a break? And I unanimously got voted down, and everybody said we gotta keep going. So we're up and running, and so we're going to pick up our speakers as we had planned them, and we'll be announcing them, rolling them out. But for this month, we have Tim Barkin, who has written a very important book called The Cost of Loyalty, and the subtitle is in the write-up. Tim, what's the subtitle?
Dishonesty, hubris, and failure in the U.S. military.
Wow, that covers a lot of ground. So I'm not going to steal. I just want to say that at the committee, what we try to do, we don't really have any competition because we try to get conservatives and liberals and independent citizens of the republic together to talk about the things that the two political parties will not talk about. And so we stay away from healthcare, we stay away from the environment, immigration. We stay away from any issue where there is active political competition and where the system is working in that sense. But the money and the balance are off the table. So anything involving too big to fail banks or the military industrial complex, those are the subjects that we primarily focus on. And the military industrial complex is a very complex, large organism. It's probably the largest one in history. And so it's very complicated, and we look for ways to flip the prism and come at it and look at it. And so when Tim's book came to my attention, shortly after it came out, I read it, and I was amazed at his personal story and the story he tells. He covers a lot of ground that many people will know, but he has unique expertise, having been a professor of law now for, what is it, Tim, 21 years now at West Point.
Yes.
And he has an inside track. He's taught criminal law, constitutional law, and so the rule of law is his business. And he's been teaching this cadets. And so he's done an amazing amount of research. It took him, how many years did it take you to write this book, Tim?
Probably about six.
About six yes. years. And yes. So I think you're going to find it. So I've asked him to basically tell his story, and I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'm going to get out of the way now. And Tim, why don't you tell the story and show how your story is the story that you're addressing in the book about our military.
Thanks, John, and thanks for inviting me, and good evening to everyone. I thought, because this is an audience who is well versed in a lot of information with regard to the military, that I try to talk a little bit about my experiences. And I'm reluctant to do that because I never wanted to personalize the book or personalize any of the presentations. And this is the first time in about 19 or 20 presentations that I thought I would tell some of what I've experienced and why I reached the conclusion that inside the military, prominently today, there are essentially four values that I think prevent America from winning wars. One is loyalty over truth. Another is retaliation. Another is a lack of free speech. And a fourth is separation from American society. West Point and the Army have been resistant to civilian influence for a long time. And civilians were not hired until the mid-1990s here, only after Senators Sam Nunn and John Glenn pushed the academy to hire. I came in 2000, and I was glad to be here. I'm still glad to be here, which is an interesting story in itself, probably. But I had the idea that Stubbornly, I wouldn't leave even after I had some experiences that were somewhat unusual in regard to civilians in the military. In about 2010 and 2011, I saw things that I thought somebody should speak up and say, and I looked around and I thought, surely somebody must have seen what I've seen in the past, and there must be a book. There must be some experiences. There must be a court case about what is happening, and there wasn't any. In 2011, the opportunity came so that I could make a complaint up the chain of command, and the complaint was essentially this: at West Point. West Point has 1 3-star general and 2 1-star generals. And I said, there's an insidious corruption going on. Aside from favoritism, it really has the effect of allowing people who are not qualified to hold various positions, and it works somewhat like this. Military officers who retire are often immediately hired into the civilian positions, defeating the intent of Congress and Senators Nunn and Glenn. But in addition to that, I said, I think I can tangibly show you that the salaries, for example, of civilian professors who have not been in the military are lower than salaries of military professors, civilian professors who have been in the military. That doesn't sound like a big thing, and it probably wasn't a big thing, but nonetheless, I made the complaint because I had the opportunity, I thought, to prove it. An investigation was done, an investigation by the dean, which really essentially means he hired his friends to do the investigation, other military officers at West Point with whom he had gone to school at West Point. And in 2011, he rejected my complaint, and days later, I experienced retaliation. But it's not my saying that I experienced retaliation. I eventually made my way to something in the federal government called the Merit Systems Protection Board. And after a trial in 2012, a federal administrative judge said that West Point did indeed retaliate against me, and that because I was the prevailing party, the judge issued what's known as a corrective order in federal administrative law, but turns out to be what most people would know as an injunction. Don't retaliate against Bakken and make him do things that you would want him to do simply because he spoke up. But that necessarily, for me, wasn't the most interesting part of the case. It was probably more interesting what happened after the case. First of all, I would have to say that one should look at what retaliation is. It's really reaching out and hurting someone down the hall, or trying to hurt someone down the hall from you. And by that point, 12 years had passed when I finally won the case. And in all 12 of those years, I had received the top evaluations from various military officers, including the officer who retaliated against me, and said, okay, Bakken, you've complained. Here's what has to happen. Instead of teaching classes every other day, you have to teach classes every day, and you have to teach early in the morning, which everybody knows in the West Point system makes it very difficult for someone who's living in New York City to come to West Point at 7:30 and start teaching a class. Nonetheless, I won the case. I was the prevailing party, and then I thought things were mostly over. But what's interesting about the aftermath of the case is not thus just that it's acceptable in the military, I've experienced, for officers to reach out and hurt people, but also it's acceptable for those officers who've done that, including the officer who retaliated, who is a lawyer herself and the head of the Department of Law, to be promoted almost in essence for doing it. To make the long story short, the Army Inspector General did an investigation, found that she retaliated. Then she found another Inspector General who issued a second investigation and said, the reason we can't find that she retaliated and put something negative in her file is that when Bakken made his complaint to the Federal Administrative Board, the U.S. Systems Merit Protection Board, he titled it Bakken versus the Army. But that's like a truism, but it's protecting falsity, because as everybody knows who's been in front of federal administrative boards, you can't ever, by virtue of their rules, name the person who you say retaliated against. You always have to name the agency. It's just one of those things. It's like false advertising, saying something that's true to project a false persona. In the end, several years later, that person who retaliated, that military colonel, a JAG officer, and head of the Department of Law, was promoted to brigadier general on the day that she retired. The lieutenant general who was in control at West Point similarly was admonished by the inspector general of the Army because he didn't take action when the retaliation was decided by the judge. And as a result, he was admonished also, but he too retired with honors from the superintendent's position at West Point. Let me go to Afghanistan for just a couple things that I think might be somewhat interesting, and I'll try to make some of the bigger points and why that kind of thing at West Point, which I believe is endemic in the military, influences how America fights wars and whether America wins wars or loses wars and whether America has a good or poor reputation in the world. In 2007, I went to Afghanistan. Civilians at West Point could volunteer. West Point had a program where it was trying to create a new military academy in Kabul, modeled after West Point. In 2007, I went there after many years, probably 5 or 6 years. Civilians, a few of them, and military officers had been in Kabul trying to create this military academy for Afghanistan. I went to the dean of the military academy shortly after having arrived. I looked around and they had one class in law, but that class was within the political science department. I said to the dean at the military academy, he was somebody who had fought the Russians when the Russians invaded in 1979. I said, we both know that in the Soviet Union at that time, because he was fighting them at that time, that politics was law and law was politics. There really was no law. There was no rule of law. And I said, similarly here, you have your law class, your one law class subsumed within politics, and I have a sense that it's going to be subsumed within religion also. Let's break it into a separate department of law. Through an interpreter, he said, that's a good idea, and that's what he did. I went back to West Point and I said, they've agreed at the military academy in Afghanistan to create a new department of law. I think that's a good thing. And I'd like to create the department, and I think I know how, and here's how to do it. I proposed this, and I found later that the order went out for whatever reason, perhaps because it didn't come from somebody at West Point or someone who was in authority, that the faculty members in the Department of Law to whom I made the request, please send me your syllabi so I can create a 14-course curriculum at West Point, at the military academy in Afghanistan, modeled after West Point. They said, no, don't send it to Bakken. I created the 14 courses. I had taught about 7 of them, so I had syllabi from those 7 courses and started that department in Afghanistan. Let's go ahead to 2015 and remember that there was a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan in 2015. This is what I've experienced, and John mentioned Cy Hirsch was here watching, and I look back at some of the documents in the aftermath of My Lai, and what is very obvious is that the military has a way to diminish the responsibility or the culpability of the people who are engaged in persistent wrongdoing and very serious wrongdoing as well. It wasn't just the cover-up of the My Lai massacre, it was also the protection of the officers in My Lai. But I was talking about Kunduz in 2015. Nobody disagrees on this. Even the Pentagon found this, and 2 Army investigations found the same. Mistakenly, a U.S. Army gunship was ordered to circle for 30 to 60 minutes, and nobody disagrees whether it's 30 or 60 minutes. The Pentagon says 30, human rights organizations say 60. But for 30 minutes at least, the gunship circled the hospital in Kunduz, and shot at the hospital with cannons with no return fire. 42 doctors, nurses, and patients were killed in the hospital, almost irreplaceable in a country like Afghanistan, where becoming a nurse and a doctor is very difficult to do. There was one Army investigation by General Campbell, who was the commander in Afghanistan, and then there was a second Army investigation by General Votel, who was the commander of Central Command. And both the investigations went something like this, and this is what I found in my research across the decades, across the generations, from the 1950s to the present day. The final investigation report, and it was presented by General Votel in a press conference, but if you dig down and look at the report, it says, in essence, that there was no intent on the part of American soldiers to kill innocent people in the hospital. And the press release and the documents go on in detail, and they focus on intent. It's not just a talking point, however, in regard to focusing on intent, but as anyone who practices law in this area, or anyone who does research in this area, one knows that looking at someone's intent is not sufficient to determine culpability. And what I was able to find, and you'll see this in, as I said, in Korea, Vietnam, Kunduz, and in Iraq as well, throughout the military over the years, and this is what sometimes might be considered institutional or normative. Somehow it develops, even though there aren't any rules. There's nobody who says, right, that there was no intent to kill the people in the hospital. Nobody disagrees that anybody wanted to kill the people in the hospital. But under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, under any concept of American law, you have to look further, and you have to see whether soldiers killed with knowledge, or anybody killed with knowledge, or anybody did something recklessly or negligently. But time and time again, the military will not go into, will not delve into whether there's that additional level of culpability. They simply won't consider that kind of activity or that kind of mental thinking. And as a result, all of those people will never have any kind of serious repercussions. The final report said that there were 16 officers, including one general, who were responsible, officers and soldiers, for the killing, and they received reprimands, and some lower-ranking soldiers received reduction of rank. But to this day, there's no person who has been named. It's almost inconceivable that in American society, if a police department had encircled a hospital for 30 minutes and shot inside the hospital, that we would not even know the names of the people, the officers who did the shooting. And I'll say one last thing, and maybe, John, you can pick up and direct me in a particular way that you might want me to go. This is an entrenched situation in the military, and it's not very hopeful that it will change unless there's, well, first of all, there has to be some recognition, and my book, I think, provides some recognition of what's happening, but unless there's some movement to change the structure of the military. The military has said for 70 years, and continues to say, as a reason why the military justice system should not be changed, is that we can handle everything inside, and it gives us the ability to ensure good order and discipline of soldiers. I can say, in my experience, I have no reason to believe that that is possible. The military is an institution that is separate from American society. It sought in 1974 in the Supreme Court, and it received from the Supreme Court in decisions in 1974 and 2 decisions following that, the right to withhold constitutional protections of soldiers. The main thing that it wanted, and the main thing it continues to have, is the right to create silence within the military. That 1974, Parker versus Levy, a soldier in the Army, Captain Levy, had complained publicly that the war was wrong. He didn't want to train soldiers how to do medical procedures if they were going to do them in Vietnam. The Army prosecuted him. He was found guilty and sentenced to 3 years. The Supreme Court said, quote, "The military, because it's a separate society, has the right to withdraw those constitutional principles. And today, and I should have mentioned, one of the problems in the military also is conformity, and that's lack of free speech. Every soldier, without exception, and every officer, I think, will say this, that they will mute whatever they will say because the person who is in charge, the person who is above them, is the person who determines what they will do in their career, where they will go. A bad evaluation can end their career. It's not an institution, in my judgment, that is focused on the rule of law. It will say it is because the focus is on loyalty, which is the #1 Army value. And that's been a long time coming. It started with Samuel Huntington recognizing that in the 1920s and 1930s, and certainly after World War II, patriotism and loyalty became the prominent values in the military. And today, loyalty is that #1 value. And that's why I've said, why we've called the book The Cost of Loyalty, because the cost of loyalty is a lot of truth. And the American people have not been hearing that. And I guess I'd say, in summing up, one more point, and that is, I guess the final conclusion is, probably in all those wars, if we think back, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, at the beginning, even before they began, or certainly shortly after they began, military officers recognized that these wars would be difficult and probably were unwinnable. But there's not one of them that I know of, certainly not one general, who has spoken up publicly and told us that we can't win the wars and we should disengage or we should withdraw.
Well, Tim, we generally run the salons till about 8:15, but I'm going to, with the Zoom, we're going to try to end it at 8 unless we have so many questions. People get mad at me when they don't get to ask their questions. But when you and I were talking, basically, I was asking you who were your favorite warriors and who you think the greatest military geniuses were, and we were knocking around Genghis Khan and Napoleon and Alexander the Great and so forth. And if we put all of them into Vietnam or into Afghanistan or into Somalia or Sudan or Syria, any of these places, all these 9 unconstitutional presidential wars that we're fighting, would we have a different outcome? And I think we went back and forth on that, and we concluded that, I believe they're unwinnable. You can't prove that. Beyond, it's not provable. Well, you could argue it is, but my view is that they weren't winnable. So it wasn't a question of the talent. It was really more the duty of the military to tell the civilians that they can't beat a insurgency. Right? We got our nation was born out of an $80 million insurgency. So we're on the same wavelength on that, right? So basically, the question then is, why didn't the military tell the civilians that what they were trying to do was unwinnable? And I think the answer that I have, and I wanted to ask if you can explore this. Why is the goal of the military really to win wars, or is the goal of the military to get the most amount of money out of a government that any government in the history of the world has ever gotten? I don't think any government in the world has given more money to the military than ours has in the last 3,000 years. So haven't they succeeded? And are we really asking the wrong question?
Your second point is inarguable. The military has received more resources, more manpower, and more support than any military possibly could, at a cost of 100,000 U.S. in those 4 wars. And nobody disagrees with this either. 3 to 6 million people in those countries. In some respect, the military has received everything that it could ever want. In regard to your first question, why do military officers, why do the generals not speak up? Tom Ricks has written about this, and his conclusion, quite plainly, is that the generals have too many personal interests and selfish interests, and that's the reason that they don't speak up. That may be the primary reason, but certainly a secondary reason is that they've been educated and trained not to speak up. Somehow they think it's a constitutional obligation, an ethical or moral duty not to speak up. We saw this with General Mattis after he resigned as Secretary of Defense, and he still refused to speak up. But probably Harold Johnson, who was the Secretary of the Army from 64 to 68 during the Vietnam War, when his classmate, Westmoreland, was leading the war, told us, or he told us later when he was near death, long after he had a chance to speak up, he said, what I really wanted to do was go to the White House and tell President Johnson that this war could not be won, and that if Johnson wanted me to do more, he needed to call up many more soldiers than he was willing to do. But he said, I didn't do that. I wanted to go in there and throw my 4 stars and leave and go out and publicly tell that this war could not be won to Americans. And then he said at the end, I will go to my grave with that lapse in moral courage on my back. And I think that that's probably the case now. If we look at what the Washington Post reported in 2019, December of 2019, the so-called Afghanistan papers, those papers are just over about 604 reports of interviews with top American officials, civilian and military. And I've read about 100 of them so far, and all of them say exactly the same thing. There are a few by reports by Afghan generals or Afghan leaders. They all say the same thing, that we didn't, General Lute says, former General Lute, West Point graduate and a leader in Afghanistan, we didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were doing. Nothing has changed between Vietnam and Afghanistan.
Now, in your book, you talk about McMaster and the dereliction of duty, but why don't you cover that and how that how he ended up not doing what he criticized his superiors
well, McMaster is very well thought of at West Point. My friends have written with him. He taught here as a captain, and then he went on and wrote that well-regarded book, Dereliction of Duty, where he criticized the Joint Chiefs of Staff for not speaking up, for not telling the truth. And he was especially critical of Maxwell Taylor. And some of my friends know McMaster well and say only good things about him. And I can't say that I've heard anything bad about him personally, but nonetheless, when he had the opportunity to speak up, when he was in the Trump administration, he did not speak up. It's what he was complaining about 20 years ago when he wrote the book, he became in the administration. His new book is coming out next week, and maybe there'll be something in it that helps us understand his thinking as to why he did not speak up and tell us what he truly believed.
Interesting. So let's open it up, and I'm sure we've got a lot of pent-up demand here. Who would like to? Cy, are you there? Do you want to? I know you're. Do you want to ask Tim a question? Explore a particular.
No, I can you hear me? I had put myself. I was on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you.
I'll say that he's an amazingly courageous guy, because I've been dealing with what we call the West Point Protective Association since I looked into the initial investigations of Mulloy that went nowhere. And what he's saying now, I hope it sparks some debate. I know the Congress and others are very concerned with other issues right now, but the West Point problem, I have some friends that, years ago, tried hard, decades ago, to convince the Army, the military academies to have some of their third-year class go abroad for 6 months and live with middle-class families around the world that many colleges do, because these guys were coming out of the academies, Navy, Army, Air Force, so limited in their external knowledge. And what Bakken is doing is just fantastic. And so I want to hear what other people have to say more than what I think.
Yeah, Tim, I said to Tim, I said, you know, you're really you're a candidate for a Defender of Liberty Award. We've given it to whistleblowers, Benny and Drake, people that built the software systems that were turned for foreigners that were turned on us. So you've got a lot of guts, and you know, Aristotle said courage is the most important of virtues because without it, none of the others are possible. So who else do we have here? Who else would like to go? Is that you, Paul? Is that you have your hand up? You, Max, I can't see.
Let me unmute, John. I just posted a question, which I'm full of admiration for Tim's courage and frankly amazed that he's still teaching at West Point. Bravo. I do wonder, however, isn't there an inconsistency in the ethic of the military to make obedience the primary code of conduct? Because finally, in the final analysis, they have to be ordered in the battle. Isn't it rather the civilians who are responsible for the military who should be the ones who insist on no misdoing or prosecuting misdoing by the military?
That's what I've advocated, that civilians should be more responsible for the military. A lot of people have said that the military is not responsible for the losses in the wars. It's really the civilian administration. I just mostly disagree with that because it's the military that willingly says we will go and do whatever you want, despite knowing that there will be difficulties winning, or maybe, as John said, it's almost impossible to win. But in my view, the military has become so separate from civilian society that it's almost a fourth branch of government. It's almost unaccountable. More than that, the military itself is very insular. For example, about 50% of the soldiers in the military come from 5 states, 4 states in the South: Alabama, South Carolina, Florida, Texas, and California. Majority of the soldiers in the military come from military families. I've worked obviously with the military for 21 years. I don't come from a military background. I was not someone who served in the military, and I have the greatest respect. But nonetheless, that kind of insular nature only produces conformity. And moreover, the kinds of people that who come to the military today have values that are very different from the values of a cross-section of America. I'm not arguing against their values. I'm just arguing that there should be a cross-section of values in the military, and there really isn't. And the people who do have the inclination to speak up find it almost impossible to do. I'll give just one example. There's a military statute, a military penal code that says disrespect is a criminal violation. That particular provision has below it an explanation, and it says, quote, "The truth is no defense." That is to say, you could speak up and say something truthful. The tank has no track under it, or the gun has no bullets, and if you said it disrespectfully to any officer, you could be prosecuted criminally for it. That's a formalistic kind of explanation for why people don't speak up, but it's that that thing that exists. Nobody will say anything. I'll just say one last thing to that excellent comment. Just before I came on, I looked back through my email. I won the case in 2012, and people at West Point obviously knew about that. And I published the book in, my publisher published the book in February of 2020, just a few months ago. And all told, one person at the military academy has said congratulations on either the case or the book.
So when you went to the
what I thought were my closest civilian friends.
when you went to the library, when you went to the library to look for your book, or when it was in the bookstore where they sell, what did you find?
I I found what I expected to find. The book had been banned. I went to the manager and I asked, why is my book not included with the other professors on the prominent rack of West Point authors? And he said, the military's banned your book. But he also said, he's a civilian. If they hadn't banned it, I would have banned it also because I don't think it's appropriate. I went to the library and asked the reference librarian, have you seen this book? I've heard cadets asking about it. And she says, yes, I'd like to read it, but we don't have it. And as of this week, we still don't have it in the bookstore or the library.
So if I were so I was asking Tim, gosh, if I were an ambitious kid at the academy, I'd be afraid to come and talk to you. But a number of cadets have come to you and had confidential talks. And why don't you describe what was there? Was it more emotional or more intellectual, or what were the
It's probably just like anything else in the world. We want some affirmation that our feelings are shared by somebody else. And I think the cadets found in the book, and some of them have read it and some of them have read reviews of it, they have the feeling that I've recognized that there's something not quite right about a culture that stifles freedom the way West Point and the other two academies stifle freedom through formality and through informal norms as well. And my experience is that if they feel that they can speak confidentially, then they're willing to speak up. Otherwise, it's very difficult to receive any information from cadets or from officers. I will say my biggest regret at the military academy at West Point is that I don't really get to know officers and cadets or even civilians as much as I would like, or we would like, because there is a superficiality to the discussions that can be had. Nobody wants to say anything that can be used against them by somebody else. And remember, at every event, at every social event, there are people who are above you in rank, and because of this hierarchical nature, and yes, all militaries are hierarchical, but because of the extreme hierarchical nature of the U.S. military, any person above you can hurt you. And as a result, there's almost no willingness to speak freely about anything more in depth than the news.
Pat Mulloy, I see that you raised your hand. Are you, Pat's on our board. Pat?
One, thanks, John, for putting on this wonderful program. Mr. Bakken, what percentage of the officer corps are not from the military academies? Do we still have a lot of people who become officers from civilian universities like NROTC or OTC programs? Secondly, John talks about these endless wars, which are bankrupting our country and forbidding, we're not able to focus on the real problems afflicting our country because we're so involved in all these damn wars. Would it be helpful if we did the draft again so that the civilian population would pay more attention to what wars we're getting into, because their young people would be involved in them?
We certainly need more people included in the military. I don't know that I would favor a draft, but I certainly would favor repurposing the military academies and making them eligible, making them national universities to anybody who wants to come and serve 5 years in government, whether it be the military or elsewhere. The military academies provide about 25% of the officers to the military each year: Army, Navy, Air Force. The number of graduates will be just shy of 3,000 a year. However, that is, seniors graduating will be 3,000 officers. However, the cost of that, nobody's sure because the military doesn't tell us how it's counting, but there was one accounting in 2002, and the cost per year of the 3 military academies was over $1 billion. Probably at West Point now, the cost of running the place for 1 year is about $500 million. each year, West Point graduates about 950 cadets. That's obviously an enormous amount of money for very few graduates. Most of those graduates will leave after 5 years, and probably about 2/3 of those graduates will leave after 8 years. They have a duty, responsibility to serve 5 years active duty and 3 years in the reserves. After 8 years, most of them will be gone. One final comment on your question, which is very prescient one, and that is in the years 1812 to the present day. As I've mentioned, the West Point is controlled by 3 generals. 147 of 150 of the generals, there have been a total of 150 generals, 147 of them are West Point graduates. It's impossible in that kind of monolithic culture to have intellectual variety. What happens here today, I can point out, has happened at West Point 200 years ago.
So we have some very prominent women associated with the committee. Catherine Lutz and Molly McCartney are both on our board, and they've done amazing work. Catherine up at Brown sat around and she can describe. We did a salon for her last year, and she's documented the cost of war. And then Molly's written this great book called American War Machine. She thought the military-industrial complex was too complicated a title, and she just called it the War Machine. Molly, or you, Catherine, like to jump in here? Okay, maybe I lost them. Okay, so let's move on if they're not ready.
Wait, John, can you hear me now?
Yeah, okay, I hear you now.
I was on. Okay. My question is, what specific things can you suggest that might address these issues? I'm listening to what you're saying. It's clearly a huge problem, complex problem, but and Pat mentioned a draft as a way to break through. But what practical steps or thinking or proposals can you suggest to approach this, other than people simply being educated about the problem?
People being educated about the problem, of course, will come from the outside, and that's necessary, but Americans don't seem very willing to become educated about the military. They seem very satisfied with its performance despite the losses, or if one doesn't like losses, the lack of fulfilling the mission in the last 4 years. Every year, the military continues to be the most respected institution. Formally, we could change the military overnight if Congress had the willingness to do it. And even if Congress didn't have the willingness to do it, if I were just looking inside the institution, I would say, number one, change the hierarchical nature of the military. The idea that absolute obedience needs to be registered every day, every hour, is simply not useful in a modern society. The military needs to be absolutely flatter. Number two, the military justice system, which is the glue that holds the hierarchy together, should be disbanded. It simply doesn't work. It's a system that inherently has conflict everywhere inside it. A commander who controls the institution, West Point, for example, is solely in charge of issuing criminal charges. In addition to that, that person, that superintendent, any military commander anywhere, is the person who decides who the jurors will be. Just by doing that, you can decide how a case will be decided. But nonetheless, take sexual assault at the military academies. The military academies have received a lot of pressure. A commander who decides not to bring a charge will be accused of not being harsh enough and not being responsive to alleged violence. And a commander who brings charges will be accused of bringing charges because the public pressure is too great. It's simply an impossible situation. No person, no matter how good he or she is, no matter how how good the judgment is that the person will exercise can make judgment-free decisions in those situations. Third, I've said the military academy should be repurposed. Somebody suggested to me, because the military academies produce so many of the top generals and admirals, if you repurpose the military academies, maybe you would be able to get at what I've described in the military, the problems, loyalty over truth, etc. And I think that would be a way to go. Those would be three very practical things that could be done. If Congress decided to do it, it could do it overnight, or if a president decided to do it, he or she could do it overnight as well. Very straightforward things.
And would congressional hearings on something like this also be useful? I mean, John and a group of us tried to get some hearings on the whole question of these wars, and this sounds to me like something else, if Congress did its job, would be the way to call attention to it, frame it, and perhaps get some action.
It would be useful if there could be hearings in the first place, but it's also necessary to have experts testify at the hearings, experts who can refute what the military is saying. I'll give one example with regard to sexual assault, which is the topic of the day at the military academies. Sexual assault, alleged extremist groups, and racial issues at the academies. Every 2 years, the military academy superintendents have to testify before Congress, and every 2 years they will say that the sexual assault problem at the academies is, quote, on par. I'm quoting somebody from the Pentagon who said that last spring, not last spring, the spring before that, is on par with other colleges. But what I did is simply decide to look at the statistics. I used the Pentagon studies, but I found a study that nobody had looked at before. That study showed that the sexual assault rate at colleges, at all colleges around the country, 2-year, 4-year, universities, showed that about 5 women out of 1,000 suffer sexual assault every year. That's an estimate. But the Pentagon showed through its studies that over 30 women per 1,000 experience sexual assault per year. Those are allegations. But nonetheless, if you compare the two studies, which are very analogous, then you can conclude, as I did in the book, and as I was telling John yesterday, nobody's refuted, nobody from the military or elsewhere has refuted what I've said. The sexual assault rate at the military academies is 5 times greater than it is at civilian colleges. Well, you can ask the question, why? And there are only 2 answers. One is that the people who are being recruited into the academies are not the people who should be here. And the other is, and this is a current area of my thinking and research right now, is that because of a hierarchical society, a hierarchical institution like the military or a church or any other institution, that hierarchy creates a floor beneath which violence cannot go. And I think there's a very strong likelihood that that's what we have in the military today. That hierarchy where people can control each other very easily, given to us partly by the Supreme Court in the Parker versus Levy case. The military is a separate society, goes a long way in explaining why the military has intractable problems. The hierarchy has to be changed.
Good. So I think, was it, who was it that raised their hand?
Jim Cobey.
Cobey, good.
I just hope the military and all academies train or give courses, good general courses, liberal arts courses, and encourage the students to travel and see the world before they get involved and actually on duty as the military. I was in Cambodia with the Red Cross. A bunch of American military came in with the UN. They didn't know why we were there. I hope these students know what's going on in the world before they become active duty.
The academies do travel. The students do travel now. There are good programs that provide that. However, the academies are very monolithic in their discipline. 50% of the students at the academies major in engineering, and that's getting more and more extreme every year. And the main reason for that is the academies want to be accredited by an engineering professional organization. Despite saying that military service should be for a career if you graduate from academy, the cadets are specifically trained to take a curriculum that allows them to be certified as a professional engineer when they leave West Point. The additional problem is that in most colleges and universities, probably all except the academies, to do that engineering professional curriculum, you have to spend 5 years at a college. Because the academies only let the cadets spend 4 years, they have to fulfill those professional credits. An outside agency, not the US government, telling them what to do. The cadets have to take fewer liberal arts, humanities, social science courses and more engineering courses. Even the ones who aren't majoring in engineering have to take at least 3 engineering courses. I've argued and I've explained in the book that engineering, while very creative, requiring extremely bright and brilliant people, is not the discipline that is most useful in helping cadets who become officers and go into Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere be, quote, the mayors of the cities. It's probably just about the last major that we would want, the last discipline that we would want the cadets to have when we're trying to develop them, educate them to be officers who are exercising critical judgments in foreign nations.
I think it's part of history. History gives you a background to work with. And I'm a surgeon. I did science, but I still majored in history.
So, Tim, I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier. So in the, everybody knows Congress is not doing their job. That's a public secret, right? So the public opinion polls are, they're poll less than 10%, but we've got these extraordinary poll ratings for the military. And so there's a total disconnect here. And you and I have talked about it, but why don't you get into that a little more? You talked about they're obviously have unlimited resources in terms of propaganda. I was sitting at the National Baseball Stadium with the owner of the team, and I was told that that they get substantial money from the military at the baseball games to put the military up front. It's not just the thing at the beginning. It's and they bring them out. I forgot what inning they bring them out. Anyway, they're doing that with basketball. They're pouring money into the owners of the basketball teams and the stock car racing. So football. There's I love Cy Hirsch or someone. I don't know who's written an article about how much money actually goes into the propaganda campaign for the military. So that's one element, but obviously it's much more complicated than that. Why do you think why is there, you're essentially saying that the military is not doing their job, and we know Congress isn't, but there's a total disconnect here with the American people and the military. And if you can explore that. I think Ike is the last president we had that actually brought in the services once a month and went over he'd spend a separate day for the Army and a separate day for the Marines. He'd bring the Navy in on a different day, and he'd go through each line item. I don't think we've had civilian control of the military really effectively in that way since Ike. But there's just a total disconnect here. Why are the American people so disinterested in where we're pouring more resources than any society's ever poured into the military in history?
It's a little bit like asking, John, how norms get created in society. How do people become polite in one situation and impolite in another situation? Maybe I can give you an anecdote that might be somewhat useful in what you're saying. I talked about in the book the military contractors that are at West Point. Today, in fact, we had an honorable living day, which is a good idea. And we were all instructed to go to the football stadium called Mikey Stadium. And I turned into the stadium probably about 7 1,000 of us spread out. And as I reported in the book, the first thing that I saw was a big tarpaulin with Boeing. And you can walk around the military academy and see in the gymnasium and in the football stadium the influence of the military contractors. It is also seen in the most important day of the academic year at West Point, Projects Day, where military contractors are sponsoring various projects. Today, even, and this is a good idea in some respect, because it gives cadets practical experience, cadets will be working with military contractors. But of course, from the point of view of military contractors, Boeing, Northrop, the companies that build tanks and other weapons, they have an interest in the cadets who will become generals. During the football games at West Point, there is an engineering company, a military contractor called MCOR. When the West Point Army football team makes a first down and gets a new set of downs, the public address announcer says, another first down. And the cadets will be trained to cheer Army first down, and then the announcer will say, sponsored by MCOR. MCOR, the engineering company, the government contractor, is headed by a West Point graduate. And as you've recognized now in our discussion, it is clear that there are vested interests, of course, obviously, in the contractors. But what's somewhat troubling is that the contractors have an inside track at West Point where the cadets are 17 and 18 years old when they start and 22 when they leave. It's very difficult to change.
Good. So I see, Ivan, I see you're here tonight. Do you followed the military for your whole career and written extensively about it? Would you like to ask Tim a question?
Yeah, I was just, you made the statement that the military is, the most popular institution. Can you list some of the causes for that? I mean, it seems like other organizations that lose a lot of war, aren't very good sometimes at what they're supposed to be doing, like losing wars. And I would use the word lose for Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. The recent record, it hasn't been very good. I guess they can always blame it on the civilians, but why do you think the military is enduringly popular in the society? Is it guilt over what happened in Vietnam or something else, or the way they market it, saying, well, we need to support the troops? Instead, we know that the institution has problems, but it seems to be that the institution is popular too. So I just wanted to get your more specifics on that point, because I agree with your point. I just wondered what the reasons were for it.
Samuel Huntington, the former professor who talked about the clash of civilizations, said that the development of patriotism and loyalty after the world wars created a situation where the military started to be above reproach. After Vietnam, the military made a concerted effort in public relations. Today, the public relations departments of the military, the press offices, and the recruiting offices have as many employees as the Department of State. But also, what is sometimes not recognized is that the military ethos, despite the military being a separate institution, authorized by the Supreme Court, a separate society, has seeped into civilian society. And this has occurred because of federal statutes, because of an Obama administration executive order that requires civilian government agencies to hire military veterans. Up to 33%, I think it's 31 now, I think it was a high of 33% of the federal civilian employees in the executive agencies controlled by the president are military veterans. To give one example that's a little bit more current, police departments, nobody's exactly sure, probably have among their police officers 33% who are military veterans. There's been very little research on this, but there is one fairly prominent by researchers in Texas of the Dallas Police Department, and it shows that military veterans who become police officers are 2 times more likely to shoot their guns while on duty if they were veterans, and they're 3 times more likely to shoot their guns while on duty if they were military veterans who had deployed at some time in their careers. Deployed doesn't mean that they saw combat. It means that they went somewhere as part of a mission, but nonetheless, the statistics indicate that the military is bringing a certain level of violence into American society. Another professor has done more research on this than I have. Hugh Gunderson, an anthropologist, I think he's at George Washington University, has said that there can only be one conclusion, and that is the military is recruiting people who have a certain disposition, or the people who have been recruited are trained by the military to exercise in a certain way, to exhibit violence in a certain way, and that's part of the military nature, of course, but the soldiers who are re-entering society are not adapting. They're bringing that military ethos in, not only with regard to police forces, but also in regard to civilian jobs. And that ethos is one of conformity, and if you don't conform, there will be retaliation. I've watched the retaliation that has occurred in the American government for a long time, even prior to the Trump administration, and it is something that seems very well connected to the military, which I talk about in a lot of detail in the book.
Well, good. We've now past 8 o'clock, and if there's unless there's someone that has a question they have to ask, if there is anyone, speak up. I see we've got Doug Bandow here, who's done a lot of work in this area. And Doug, do you want to ask the last question?
No, that's fine. I'm happy listening to everybody.
Great. Well, I think you got a lot of guts, Tim, and if you didn't exist, I don't know if we'd have the imagination to invent you. But I said to him, you're you're a very unusual guy to get up and do this for 21 years, and you were really.
Well, I have to say, John, one reason that I stuck it out is that I wanted to be able to be working at the military academy when the book came out, because I didn't want the military to be able to say that this was a disgruntled person who left and doesn't have any information. I wanted to put them in the position of having to criticize me while I'm here, and then I could defend myself. And so, in a sense, it's probably a personality defect or disorder that I've had, just a little bit too much stubbornness on my part, but also I just wanted to see it through, and I think I've done that to this point.
Well, you're a great American, and we love your grit and your courage, and really want to congratulate you on
thanks a lot
your testimony, because you have an enormous amount of credibility to say these things, given where you are.
Thanks a lot.
Well done.
So thank you.
May you survive.
I'll be fine. Thank you very much, and thank you for the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Good night.
Good night. Bye.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Tim.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John.
Thank you.